It was the sound that woke her, not the wind rattling the cabin walls, not the groan of old wood settling in the pre-dawn chill. This was different. It was a sound that didn't belong on her mountain, a thin, reedy whimper that slipped through the cracks in the door and curled around the edges of her sleep. It wasn't quite animal, and it wasn't quite human. Yara's eyes snapped open in the dark. For 2 years since she'd laid her husband Thomas to rest under the lone cottonwood on the hill, her world had been silent. The neighbors stopped coming. The trail to her homestead grew over. Even the birds seemed to avoid the eaves of her cabin, as if grief itself had poisoned the air. Silence was her only companion. Until now. Her feet hit the cold floorboards without a sound. Her hand, calloused and sure, reached for the rifle she kept mounted over the hearth. It was an extension of her arm, as familiar as the ache in her bones. She moved through the darkness of the single room, her breath held tight in her chest. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong. A predator wouldn't whimper like that. A lost traveler would call out. This was something else. Something fragile and strange, waiting right on her doorstep. She reached the door, the cold steel of the rifle a stark comfort against her palm. She didn't bother with the peephole. It had been frosted over for weeks. Instead, she listened. The whimpering came again, weaker this time, punctuated by a desperate scratching sound against the wood. She took a deep breath, braced herself for whatever was on the other side, and pulled the heavy door inward. The pale light of dawn spilled onto the porch, illuminating a scene that made no sense. There, shivering in the cold, was a wolf pup. It was impossibly small, no bigger than a loaf of bread from her oven, its paws still comically large for its trembling body. Its fur was matted with mud and melting snow, its small sides heaving with an exhaustion so deep it seemed impossible it was still standing. It was a wild thing, lost and dying at her door. She should have closed it. She should have let the mountain claim what was its own. But it was the object clenched in the pup's jaw that stopped her cold. The thing that made the air freeze in her lungs and the world tilt on its axis. It was a piece of cloth, a small, faded swatch of a baby blanket. It was pale yellow, the edges frayed, and hand-stitched into the corner, with thread that had nearly worn away, was a single, tiny blue star. The pup looked up at her, its eyes the color of smoke and ash. It held her gaze for a beat, a strange, knowing intelligence in their depths. Then it carefully opened its mouth and dropped the blanket at her feet. It sat back on its haunches, a silent offering, as if to say, "This is for you." Yara's rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The world shrunk to that small piece of cloth on her porch. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossible. Because she knew that blanket. She had stitched that tiny blue star herself 6 long winters ago. And then she had buried that blanket, along with all her hopes, in a small wooden box alongside the stillborn son she never got to hold. The box was in the loft, nailed shut, buried under years of dust and forgetting. So how was it here? "Where?" she whispered, the word a ragged puff of air. "Where did you get this?" The pup just watched her, its head tilted. It didn't flinch as she knelt, her knees protesting in the cold. She reached out a trembling hand, expecting it to snap or recoil. But it didn't. It leaned into her touch, its fur cold and damp, a tiny heart beating a frantic rhythm against her palm. The world outside, the cold, the rifle, it all faded away. There was only the impossible thing in front of her. A ghost from her past delivered by a creature of the wild. She scooped the pup into her arms. It was lighter than air, a bundle of cold fur and fragile bones. She brought it inside, kicking the door shut against the world that no longer made sense. She laid the pup on the rag rug by the hearth and stoked the dying embers of the fire back to life. Her hands shook as she picked up the blanket from the floor. She ran a thumb over the stitched blue star. It was real. This was happening. The pain she had buried so deep it had become a part of her broke free, a raw, sharp pang in her chest. A pain that had hollowed her out long before her husband's death ever could. She held the tiny, shivering pup against her chest, wrapping it in a dry towel. "Whose are you?" she murmured. Not to the pup, but to the silence, to the ghosts in the room. "Who sent you?" The pup only burrowed deeper into her warmth, letting out a soft sigh of contentment. And for the first time in 2 long, silent years, Yara's cabin didn't feel quite so empty. But as the warmth of the fire spread, a new feeling took root. A cold, creeping dread. This wasn't a miracle. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. And she had no idea who had sent it, or what they wanted. Sleep was impossible. The cabin, usually a sanctuary of silence, was suddenly alive with sound. Every creak of the floorboards was a footstep. Every howl of the wind in the pines was a voice calling her name. She sat in the rocking chair, the rifle across her lap, watching the pup sleep by the fire. It hadn't wandered here by chance. Something had brought it. Someone. The feeling was a certainty, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. The pup had been sent. For her. As the first true light of day broke, painting the snow outside in shades of gray and pink, she saw them. Through the frosted window pane, she saw tracks in the fresh layer of snow that had fallen overnight. Her breath hitched. She had checked the porch meticulously when she brought the pup in. There had been nothing but the pup's own small prints. These were new, and they weren't paw prints. She threw on her heavy coat, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stepped outside. The cold air bit at her face. There, leading away from the edge of her porch, was a single line of footprints. They were small, too small for a man, and they were bare. A child's barefoot tracks, pressed deep into the snow, leading away from her cabin and vanishing into the dense, dark line of the trees. The sight sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. A child had been here, in the dead of night. They had stood on her porch, close enough to touch her door, had left the wolf pup, and then had simply turned and walked away. Barefoot. Into the frozen wilderness. It made no sense. Why leave the pup? Why not knock? Why walk barefoot into the deadly cold? "What is this?" she whispered to the empty clearing. The pup, which she'd left sleeping by the fire, let out a sharp bark from inside, as if answering her question. She glanced back at the cabin, then at the tracks. A terrible choice bloomed in the silence. Let it go. Pretend she hadn't seen it, or follow. She couldn't leave it. She couldn't live with the thought of a child dying in the snow, not after what she'd lost. She went back inside, wrapped the now warm pup in her own shawl, and tucked the small breathing bundle inside her coat. It was a comforting weight against her chest. She grabbed her lantern, though the sun was rising, and stepped back out, her boots crunching in the snow. She followed the tracks. The silence of the woods was different now. It wasn't empty. It was watching. She could feel it on the back of her neck. Every snap of a twig under her boot sounded like a gunshot. The pines stood like silent, snow-dusted sentinels, holding their breath, guarding a secret. The barefoot tracks were eerily purposeful. They didn't wander. They moved in a straight, determined line deeper into the forest. After 10 minutes of walking, her eyes caught a flash of color against the white. Something snagged on the low-hanging branch of a pine tree. She reached for it, her fingers clumsy with cold. It was a piece of ribbon, faded yellow, frayed at one end. It was an exact match to the ribbon that had been tied once upon a time to the corner of the baby blanket. The blanket that was currently sitting on her table. The blanket that had been buried in a locked box in her loft. Her hand clenched around the ribbon, the rough fabric digging into her palm. This was impossible. This was a nightmare. Someone had been in her house. They had gone into her loft, opened a nailed-shut box, and taken the one thing that held the last shred of her past. But who? And why? Why not just take something valuable? Why this cruel, intimate theft? Why leave it in the mouth of a wolf pup? And who was the child who had walked barefoot into these woods? She pushed forward, a cold fire now burning in her gut. She was no longer just following tracks. She was hunting for an answer. The trail led her down a steep, wooded slope towards the frozen creek that cut through her property. And there, at the water's edge, the track stopped. The snow was churned and scuffed in a small circle, as if the child had paused, pacing back and forth, hesitating. Maybe they had fallen through the ice. Her heart seized at the thought. She scrambled down the bank, her eyes scanning the creek's frozen surface for any sign of a break. The ice was solid, unbroken. But nestled in the frozen reeds near the bank, another splash of color caught her eye. It was a scrap of cloth, no bigger than her hand. It was deep red, the fabric coarse and hand-woven. It was the torn edge of a dress. She picked it up. The material was unfamiliar, but the style, the weave, it was from one of the Lakota camps that were scattered miles to the north. But there had been no contact with them for weeks, not since the first heavy snows had blocked the northern pass. They were cut off from the world, just like her. So how had a Lakota child ended up here? She stood there, the wind whipping her hair across her face, holding the two clues in her hand. A yellow ribbon from a ghost's blanket, a red scrap from a stranger's dress. The pup whined softly from inside her coat, a small, warm vibration against her chest, as if it could sense her confusion and fear. She turned and headed back to the cabin, her mind a whirlwind of questions that had no answers. The woods felt darker now, the trees closing in. She was no longer just a grieving widow living in isolation. She was part of something else, something she didn't understand, something that had brought the wilderness and its secrets right to her door. Back in the warmth of the cabin, the world outside seemed to fall away. Yara's focus narrowed to the two living things that had shattered her solitude, the pup and the mystery it represented. She set about her tasks with a grim determination, the way she did everything. She brewed a thin broth from chicken stock and dried herbs, her hands moving with an old, familiar rhythm. As she held a shallow bowl for the pup to sip from, its tiny pink tongue lapping eagerly at the warm liquid, she noticed something she hadn't before. In the delicate fold of its left ear, there was a small, perfectly cut notch. She gently tilted its head to get a better look. This was no scar from a fight with a sibling, no tear from a thorny bush. The cut was clean, precise, almost surgical. It was a mark, a brand, like a rancher marks his cattle. "You were claimed," she whispered, her voice low. The pup looked up at her, its smoky eyes unblinking. "You belonged to someone." This was no stray. This was a creature that had been chosen, marked for a purpose, and sent on a mission that had ended on her porch. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through her. That night, she didn't even try to sleep. She sat by the fire, the sleeping pup at her feet, and laid out the pieces of the puzzle on the rough-hewn table, the yellow blanket with its impossible star, the matching ribbon found in the woods, the scrap of a red Lakota dress, the barefoot tracks of a child who had disappeared, and now, the pup, a marked animal, a messenger. She wasn't a woman who believed in spirits or signs. The world had beaten that out of her long ago, replacing it with the hard, cold truths of survival. A harsh winter, a failed crop, a baby born silent, a husband taken by fever. Those were the things that were real. But this felt different. This felt like a story being written around her, and she was the only one who didn't know the plot. The pieces didn't fit into the world she knew. They were fragments of a darker, stranger reality. Just past midnight, when the fire had burned down to glowing orange coals, the pup stirred. It rose, stretched its small body, and padded silently to the door. It scratched once. A single, deliberate scrape of its claws against the wood. Then it turned its head and looked directly at her. The message was clear. Someone was out there. Again. Yara's blood ran cold. She snatched the rifle from its hooks, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She moved to the door, the pup standing at her feet, a low, barely audible growl vibrating in its chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was a growl of recognition. She didn't throw the door open. She eased it open a crack, peering into the night. The moon was high and full, casting an ethereal silver light over the snow-covered clearing. Every branch, every pine needle, was coated in frost, gleaming like spun glass. The world was silent, still, and breathtakingly beautiful. At first, she saw nothing. Just the familiar landscape of her isolation, the trees, the snow, the deep shadows, the shimmer of her own breath in the frozen air. Then a flicker of movement. To the left, near the edge of the woods, a shape, crouched low to the ground, half hidden behind a snow-laden fallen log. It was small, too small to be a threat, too small to be a man. Yara didn't move. She didn't call out. She just watched, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of the rifle. The silence stretched, tight and fragile. The pup at her feet gave a soft whine, a strange, pleading sound. It took a hesitant step forward onto the porch, its tail giving a single tentative wag. And that's when the figure rose. It was the child. A girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Her dark hair hung in matted, uneven strands around a face smudged with soot and dirt. Her dress, the same deep red as the scrap Yara had found by the creek, was torn at the sleeve and hung loosely on her thin frame. But it wasn't fear that gripped Yara as the child stood there, bathed in the ghostly moonlight. It was the look in her eyes. They weren't wild. They weren't startled. They were full of a desperate, pleading exhaustion. This wasn't a phantom or a threat. This was a child who had come to the end of her rope, a child who had nowhere else to go. Slowly, deliberately, the girl stepped out from behind the log and started walking towards the cabin. Her feet were wrapped in what looked like stiff, frozen rags. She moved with a pained, shuffling gait, each step an obvious effort. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks hollowed by hunger. But in her arms, she cradled something. Something wrapped in a piece of fur, held as gently and protectively as Yara had held the wolf pup. At first, Yara thought it was another animal, a rabbit perhaps, caught for food. But then the girl reached the porch steps. She stopped, looked up at Yara, and then carefully bent down. She laid her precious bundle on the snow-dusted boards. It was a doll, a strange, handmade thing, its body twisted from bark and twine. Its hair was braided from coarse black horsehair, and its face was a simple, featureless knot of wood. It was a primitive, almost unsettling object. The girl looked back up at Yara, her dark eyes huge in her small face. She opened her mouth, and a voice so hoarse and cracked it was barely a whisper touched the frozen air. "He told me you would feed me." Yara blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. The cold, the rifle, the impossible situation, it all felt like a fever dream. He? Who did? The girl's small, chapped hand lifted, and she pointed, not at the woods, not at the sky. She pointed directly at the wolf pup, who was now sitting calmly at Yara's feet. "The white wolf," the girl whispered, her voice cracking. "He came to me in the trees. He led me here." The world stood still. A wolf pup that carried memories from a locked box. A child who walked barefoot through the snow. A doll made of bark and twine. And a message delivered by an animal. Yara stood frozen on her porch, the rifle in her hand, caught between the world of logic and the world of fable. But the child's eyes, those hollow, deep brown pools of suffering, held no lie. Slowly, carefully, Yara lowered the rifle and knelt down, the way she had with the pup. She reached out a hand, palm open, a gesture of peace. The girl didn't flinch. She watched the hand approach, and then, with a small, shuddering sigh, she took a step forward and collapsed into Yara's arms. Her body was a fragile collection of bones, trembling violently. She weighed almost nothing. She smelled of pine needles and cold earth, and something ancient and lost. Yara wrapped her arms around the shivering child, pulling her close. She picked her up, the girl's head falling against her shoulder in complete surrender. She carried her inside, away from the cold and the shadows and the impossible moonlight. She wrapped the girl in her thickest quilts, piling them on the bed where Thomas used to sleep. The pup, without being told, hopped onto the bed and curled into a tight ball against the child's back, as if they were two parts of the same whole, finally reunited. Yara set a pot of water to boil, her mind numb. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't know if she was in danger. All she knew was that two lost, broken things had found their way to her door. And for the first time in a very, very long time, as she looked at the child and the pup sleeping in the firelight, Yara didn't feel alone in that cabin. She felt something else, something she hadn't dared to feel in years. She felt needed. She whispered a promise into the quiet room, a promise she hadn't made since she lost her son. "You're safe now." And as if in answer, a soft sigh escaped the sleeping child's lips. Yara had stayed up all night watching them, the girl, whose name she didn't know, and the pup, who seemed to be her guardian. As the girl slept, her breathing shallow but steady, Yara had gently tended to her. She'd washed the grime from her face with a warm cloth, and had carefully unwrapped the frozen rags from her feet, revealing skin that was raw and bruised, but miraculously unbroken. She had searched for any other injuries, any signs of what the child had endured out in the wilderness. And that's when she saw it. Tucked just above the girl's left collarbone, almost hidden by the neckline of her tattered dress, was a mark on her skin. It was dark against her pale flesh, about the size of a coin. It wasn't a bruise or a birthmark. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. It was a brand, shaped like a perfect crescent moon. It was faded, the skin around it long healed, but it was undeniably a mark of ownership. A sear of possession burned into a child's skin. A cold dread, far deeper than before, washed over Yara. This wasn't just a lost child from a nearby tribe. This was something else entirely. This was a secret, a dark one. She had touched it softly with the tip of her finger, and the girl hadn't stirred, only curled tighter into the quilt, her small hand still wrapped around the strange, unsettling doll made of bark and twine. Now, in the gray light of morning, with the girl still lost in an exhausted sleep, Yara picked up the doll. She examined it more closely. Its simple dress was sewn from a scrap of coarse, olive-drab canvas, the kind used for army tents or wagon covers. Its face was featureless, but its beaded eyes seemed to stare right through her. And tied around its waist was a thin cord of bright blue thread. It felt less like a toy and more like a talisman, an object of power. Something clicked in her mind, a memory buried deep. She stood and crossed the room to the heavy wooden chest where she kept her late husband's things. Thomas had been a surveyor for the territory, a man of maps and measurements. Before the war had swept through and changed everything, he had traveled these mountains, sketching the peaks and valleys, marking tribal landmarks, and listening to the stories the land told. She hadn't opened this chest since the day they lowered him into the ground. Her hand trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. The scent of old leather and paper filled the air. Beneath his spare set of clothes was his field journal. She pulled it out, the leather cover cracked and worn. She sat by the fire and opened it, page after page of his familiar angular handwriting, notes on elevation, sketches of rock formations, names of trails that no longer existed. and strange symbols he'd seen carved into trees. She flipped through the pages, a frantic energy seizing her. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew it was in here. Thomas had seen things. He had known things. And then she found it. Halfway through the book, on a page dated 3 years prior, a rough, hastily drawn sketch of a brand, a crescent moon. Next to it, Thomas had scribbled a few chilling words. Lost children of the hollow tree. Legend says they are taken in raids, marked, then hidden. Sold, raised in secret. Ghosts with beating hearts. A legend. A whispered story passed from trappers to tribes, a bogeyman tale to frighten children. Children stolen, branded like cattle, and hidden away in the deep, remote hollows of the mountains by people who didn't want them found. People who dealt in secrets and souls. Yara's fingers went numb. She stared at the sketch, then at the sleeping girl, the brand on her skin, the legend in the book. This wasn't a legend. It was real, and it was sleeping in her bed. Someone hadn't just lost this child. Someone had tried to erase her, to steal her from the world and hide her away where no one would ever find her. But she had escaped. The pup had found her. And somehow, through some impossible twist of fate, it had led her here, to this specific cabin, to her. Yara whispered the words aloud, her voice trembling in the quiet room. You weren't meant to die out there. As if hearing her, the girl stirred in the bed. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with sleep. Her lips parted, and a single breathy word escaped. So quiet Yara almost missed it. Mother. Yara froze, her heart stopping in her chest. Was she dreaming? Talking to the mother she'd lost? The pup, sensing the shift in the room, let out a low whine. And then, from outside, came a sound that shattered the fragile peace. The slow, heavy crunch of snow under boots. Someone was coming. Instinct took over. The grief, the confusion, it all vanished, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Yara moved without thinking. She slammed the journal shut, shoved it back in the chest, and grabbed the rifle from the hook beside the door. Her hands were steady now. This was the world she understood. A threat at the door, a line to be drawn in the snow. She didn't open the door. Not yet. She moved to the window, peering through a small, clear patch in the frost, her breath a slow, controlled cloud. The clearing was empty. The line of trees stood silent. Had she imagined it? No. There it was. A figure still distant, moving with deliberate purpose along the edge of the woods. He was tall, wrapped in heavy furs, moving with a lightness that belied his size. Not a soldier, not a clumsy trapper. He moved like a hunter, like a shadow. The figure disappeared behind a thicket of pines, then emerged again, much closer this time. A man, maybe in his 30s. Long, dark braids fell from beneath the fur-lined hood of his coat. Lakota, she realized. The red dress. It was all connected. But he wasn't walking like someone who was lost. He was walking like someone who was searching, like he knew exactly what he was looking for. And he was coming straight for her cabin. Behind her, the girl made a small, frightened sound from under the quilts. The pup, still on the bed, let out a low, rumbling growl, a clear warning this time. Yara knelt by the bed, pressing a hand gently to the child's shoulder. Stay quiet, little one. Not a sound. She stood, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. She didn't wait for him to knock. She pulled it open and stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held firmly in her hands, its barrel pointed at the ground but ready. The man stopped instantly about 30 yards from the porch. The sight of her, armed and waiting, had frozen him in his tracks. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, showing they were empty. He spoke first, his voice low and calm, but it carried clearly in the cold air. I mean no harm. Yara didn't answer. She just watched him, her eyes narrowed. I tracked him, the man continued, his gaze flicking for a moment to the cabin door. The pup. I thought he died in the blizzard. Yara's grip on the rifle tightened. Her voice was ice. "You're not here for the pup." The man took a slow, deliberate breath. "No, not just for him." He looked past her, his eyes fixed on the door, as if he could see right through it. "There's a child, isn't there?" The question hit her like a physical blow. A cold dread snaked its way up her spine. "How do you know that?" "Because she wasn't supposed to live," he said, his voice laced with a deep, weary sadness. "And if she did, if she survived, she was meant to find this mountain." His eyes, dark and heavy with a story she couldn't read, finally met hers. "The mark," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Does she have it?" Yara felt the world spin. He knew about the brand, the crescent moon, the lost children of the hollow tree. Her voice came out brittle, fragile. "A crescent, on the left side." The man closed his eyes for a moment. A wave of something, relief, pain, she couldn't tell, washing over his face. He looked like a man who had just received an answer to a prayer he'd long given up on. "Then she is the last one," he breathed. He took a step forward, slow and careful, his hands still raised. "My brother." He tried to save her when the camp was burned. He was the one who set her loose with the pup. He told me he would send a sign if she made it out, if the spirits guided her to safety. Yara's mind was racing, trying to piece it together. A burned camp, a rescue, a sign. Her grip on the rifle faltered. What kind of sign? The man's gaze fell to the cabin floor, just visible through the open doorway, to the faded yellow blanket she had left lying on the table. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That blanket. It wasn't the girl's." Yara stared at him, her heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" "It belonged to my brother's own daughter," the man said, his voice finally breaking. "She died of a fever 2 winters ago. He buried it with her." The air left Yara's lungs. A blanket from a Lakota child's grave, a blanket stitched with a star that matched the one she had made for her own son. It was impossible. A convergence of 2 sorrows, 2 losses, twisted together into one unbelievable story. "Then, why?" Yara stammered. "Why would the pup carry it?" The man's answer struck her with the force of a physical blow, rearranging her entire understanding of the world. "Because this child," he said, his eyes locking with hers, full of a terrible, profound certainty, "the one who was saved, she was your husband's daughter." The man's words hung in the frozen air between them, a declaration so impossible, so world-shattering, that Yara felt the ground beneath her feet give way. Her husband's daughter. Thomas. It couldn't be. Thomas had been her whole world. He was a good man, a quiet man, a man who had mourned their own lost child with a silent, steadfast grief that mirrored her own. The idea that he had a secret life, another family, another child. It was a betrayal so profound it threatened to undo her completely. "You're lying," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She raised the rifle again, the barrel trembling slightly. The man, Anoli, didn't flinch. He just shook his head, a deep sadness in his eyes. "I wish I was. Her mother was a woman from my tribe, Amma. Your husband. He met her during his surveys, long before he met you. They were kept apart by their people. It was a love that was not allowed. When she knew she was with child, she left the camp, trying to find him. But she never made it." He gestured to the vast, unforgiving wilderness around them. "This land, it took her, but not before my brother found her. She made him promise to watch over the child, to keep her safe." "Safe?" Yara's voice was a choked whisper. "Branded, hidden away like an animal?" "No," Anoli said, his voice hardening. "That was not his doing. After Amma's death, my brother brought the child back to our camp, to be raised as one of our own. We called her Ele, but our camp was compromised. There were men who came, men who did not respect our ways. They were the ones who followed the old legends, the ones who stole children, the hollow tree men. The name from her husband's journal. It was real. They raided us, Anoli continued, his voice low and pained. They burned our homes. They took our children. They were looking for ones who were different, ones who carried two bloods. They believed them to be special, powerful. My brother fought them. He managed to get Ile away, but he was gravely wounded. He knew he was dying. He had one last desperate plan. Yara listened, mesmerized, the rifle forgotten in her hands. He knew the stories your husband had told him, stories of you, a woman of strength who had known loss, a woman living alone on this very mountain. He believed you were the only one who could protect her. So he gave the pup the blanket, a piece of his own grief, a sign for the spirits, and sent them in your direction, praying they would find you. It was too much. A secret child, a tragic love story, a violent raid, a dying man's last hope. It was a story too wild to be true, but the sincerity in Anoli's eyes was undeniable. And then, a sound from behind her. The cabin door creaked open further. The child, Ely, had gotten up. She stood barefoot in the doorway, wrapped in one of Yara's quilts, her small face pale but calm. The wolf pup stood beside her, a loyal, furry sentinel. Ely looked at the man in the snow. Her expression wasn't one of fear. It was one of faint, distant recognition. His voice, she said, her own voice still quiet and raspy. I heard it before, in the dark. Anoli's stoic expression finally cracked. Something flickered in his eyes, a mixture of agonizing pain and soaring hope. He took a half-step forward, then stopped himself. You were too young to remember, he said to the girl, his voice gentle. I held you once, the night before the fire. Ellie took a hesitant step forward, her small hand tangled in the pup's fur for support. She didn't speak again until she was standing beside Yara, close enough to touch. She looked up at Yara, then back at the man. You smell like him, she said, a simple, devastating statement. It stunned Yara more than anything else. This child remembered, not with her mind, but with something deeper, a scent, a sound, a feeling. Is he gone? Ely asked, her eyes fixed on Anoli. Anoli crouched down in the snow, bringing himself to her level, though he still kept his distance. He died protecting you, little one, but he sent the pup. That was his promise to you, his spirit guide. Suddenly, Ailey knelt down in the snow, the quilt pooling around her. Her small fingers began to move, tracing patterns in the white powder. Circles, lines, half-moons. The stars, she whispered, lost in the memory. He told me to remember the stars. He said they would lead me home. Yara's blood turned to ice. She crouched beside the girl, her eyes fixed on the frantic drawings. It wasn't a random pattern. It was a map, a star chart, and it was the exact same pattern that had been faintly embroidered, almost invisibly, into the edge of the yellow baby blanket. A detail so small, so faded, Yara herself had missed it until this very moment. It was a map that led from the burned Lakota camp across the frozen creek, through the dark woods, to this exact cabin. Thomas, her husband, had known. He had been part of this. He hadn't just heard legends. He had been trying to find his own lost child. The journal, the maps, the symbols carved into trees. It wasn't a survey of the land. It was a search. A desperate, secret search for a daughter he'd never met. His death from a sudden fever 2 years ago. Had it really been a fever? Or had he gotten too close to the truth? Too close to the hollow tree men? The thought was a bolt of lightning, re-illuminating her entire past in a horrifying new light. Her quiet, gentle husband hadn't been quiet. He had been fighting a secret war. Yara stood up slowly, the world tilting. She looked at Anoli, then at the child, her husband's child, kneeling in the snow. "She's of two worlds now," Anoli said, his voice full of a weary resignation. "Yours and mine. In my culture, we do not take children back by force. We ask them where they belong. A choice. It all came down to a choice. For this small, traumatized girl, who had already lost everything." Yara looked at Ely, who was now looking up at her, her dark eyes searching Yara's face. An unspoken question hung in the air between them. "Who are you to me?" "What happens now?" Yara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Anoli's gaze was steady. "That depends on her, and on you. Will you let her decide?" The question was a test, a challenge. Could she open her heart to this impossible truth? Could she accept this child, this living, breathing ghost of her husband's secret life? Before Yara could answer, Ele spoke. She looked from Yara's face to Anoli's, her gaze settling somewhere in the space between them. "Can I have both?" The question was so simple, so innocent. It shattered the last of the ice around Yara's heart. It wasn't about choosing one world over the other. It was about surviving. It was about finding a way to piece together the broken parts of her life into something new. Yara reached down and took the child's small, cold hand in her own. "Yes," she said, her voice firm and clear for the first time. "Yes, you can." But even as she said it, a new fear took root. The Hollow Tree men, the ones who had branded Ely, they had lost their prize, and they would be coming to get her back. The tentative peace that had settled over the clearing was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark river. Yara knew it. Anoli knew it. They were exposed. The story of Ele's survival was no longer a secret between the three of them. It was a beacon, and the wrong people might see its light. "They will hunt for her," Yara said, her voice low, her eyes scanning the tree line. It was no longer just a forest. It was a place of concealment, a place where danger could be watching. Anoli nodded grimly, his gaze following hers. "They believe she is a key. Their leader, a man they call the Elder, is obsessed with the old prophecies. He believes a child of two bloods, born under a certain moon, will grant him power over the land itself. He will not give up on her easily." "Then we can't stay here," Yara said, the reality of their situation crashing down on her. Her cabin, her sanctuary of grief, had become a trap. "No," Anoli agreed, "but to run now, in this weather with a child, we would be easy to track. We need a plan. We need to be smarter than they are." He looked at Yara, a new respect in his eyes. "Your husband, Thomas, he was a clever man. His journal. Does it say anything more? Any locations? Names?" Yara's mind raced back to the pages she had skimmed. The maps, the symbols, they weren't just random notes. They were a breadcrumb trail. "He marked locations," she said, a new urgency in her voice. "Places he called shadow spots. Caves, old mining tunnels, places off the known maps. He was mapping their network." "He was hunting them," Anoli breathed, a look of awe on his face. "All this time we thought he was just a surveyor. He was fighting them in his own way." "And it got him killed," Yara finished, the grim certainty settling in her soul. Suddenly, Ele, who had been listening silently, tugged on Yara's sleeve. "The doll," she whispered, her eyes wide. "He told me to keep the doll safe." Yara looked down at the strange object made of bark and twine, which Ele still clutched in her hand. "Who told you, little one? The man who saved you?" Ele shook her head. "No. The lady in the tree." Yara and Anoli exchanged a confused look. "What lady?" Anoli asked gently. "Before the fire," Ele said, her voice distant, as if pulling a memory from a deep well. "A woman came to me in my sleep. She gave me the doll. She said it holds a piece of the mountain's heart. She said as long as I have it, the hollow tree men cannot take my spirit. Yara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. Amma, Ellie's mother, a spirit's protection from beyond the grave. Anoli knelt down, his eyes fixed on the doll. He reached out and gently touched the thin cord of blue thread tied around its waist. This thread, he said, his voice choked with emotion. It is from my mother's loom. Amma must have taken it before she left. This doll, it is a shield, a piece of our magic, woven with hers. The world of logic and reason was dissolving around Yara, replaced by a world of spirit guides and ghost mothers and magic dolls. But the danger was real. The threat was real. We need to go, Yara said decisively. Now. We can use my husband's notes. Find one of these shadow spots to hide in until we figure out what to do next. Anoli agreed. I will scout ahead. You gather what you can. Food, blankets, the journal. We travel light and fast. They moved with a desperate, silent efficiency. Yara packed a bag with dried meat, hardtack, and a small pot. She carefully wrapped the journal in oilcloth and tucked it deep inside. Ile, her face serious, rewrapped her doll in its piece of fur and clutched it to her chest. Anoli had already disappeared into the trees, a ghost in the wilderness, moving silently to find them a safe path. Yara took one last look around the cabin that had been her prison and her sanctuary for 2 long years. She was leaving it all behind. She put the now sleeping wolf pup, Tama, inside her coat, took Ili's hand, and stepped out into the cold. They followed the faint trail Anoli had left for them, moving through the dense woods. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird, made Yara's heart leap into her throat. She kept the rifle ready, her eyes constantly scanning the trees around them. After an hour of tense, silent hiking, they reached a ridge overlooking a deep ravine. Anoli was waiting for them, crouched behind a granite boulder. There's a problem, he said, his voice low and urgent. He pointed down into the ravine. Below them, a thin trail of smoke was rising from the trees. It was a campfire. Is it them? Yara whispered. I don't know, Anoli said. It could be trappers. But we can't risk it. The path to the nearest cave Thomas marked is on the other side of that ravine. We have to go around or we have to go through them. Going around would add hours to their journey, hours they might not have. Going through them was a gamble that could get them all killed. As they debated, Ellie, who had been staring intently down at the campfire, suddenly gasped. It's him, she said, her voice tight with fear. Who, Ellie? Yara asked, kneeling beside her. Ellie pointed with a trembling finger. A figure had emerged from the trees near the campfire. He was a large man, clad in dark, heavy furs, with a cruel, hard-bitten face. The man with the cold hands, Ile whispered, a memory of trauma surfacing in her eyes. He's the one who held me down, when they burned me. It was one of them. The hollow tree men were here. They were already on the mountain. They hadn't been tracking them. They had been waiting. They knew this was a place Thomas had frequented. They had been watching this area, waiting for any sign of the lost child. Yara's cabin hadn't been a sanctuary, it had been bait, and they had taken it. Before anyone could react, a piercing whistle echoed from the ravine below. The man with the cold hands had seen them. He raised his arm and pointed directly at them. They had been spotted. Run! Anoli yelled, grabbing Ili and pulling her behind the boulder, but it was too late. From the trees on their own side of the ravine, 2 more figures emerged, cutting off their escape route. They were dressed in the same dark furs, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. They held rifles, and they were closing in fast. They were trapped, pinned down on the ridge, with enemies on both sides. The man from the ravine below shouted, his voice a harsh, guttural command that echoed off the rocks. The elder wants the girl. Give her to us, and the woman and the brave can walk away. Yara's blood ran cold. They didn't just want Ely. They knew who Anoli was. They knew everything. "We don't walk away from family," Anoli snarled back, raising his own hunting rifle. Yara pushed Ely behind her, her own rifle coming up to her shoulder. Her mind was surprisingly calm, the years of solitude and self-reliance honing her focus to a razor's edge. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a protector, a mother in all the ways that mattered. A gunshot cracked through the air, and a chip of granite exploded from the boulder just inches from Yara's head. The fight had begun. And on this cold, lonely mountain ridge, they were outnumbered and out of time. The world devolved into a chaotic symphony of sound and motion. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls, the sharp cracks deafening in the cold air. Snow kicked up around them as bullets whizzed past, thudding into the trees and rocks that served as their only cover. Anoli was a seasoned fighter. He moved with a fluid, deadly grace, firing his rifle in short, controlled bursts, forcing the two men above them to keep their heads down. But they were pinned. The man below, the one Ely called Cold Hands, was slowly making his way up the steep slope of the ravine, using the rocks for cover, getting closer with every passing second. "We can't stay here," Yara yelled over the gunfire. "He'll be on top of us in minutes." "I know," Anoli grunted, reloading his rifle with swift, practiced movements. "The journal. Is there another way out? Another path?" Yara's mind raced. She pulled the oilcloth-wrapped journal from her pack, fumbling with the ties with numb fingers. Ailey was huddled behind her, her small body trembling, clutching the pup, Tama, who was whimpering in terror. "Stay down, Ely," Yara commanded, her eyes scanning the cryptic notes and maps her husband had drawn. It was a chaotic mess of lines and symbols. It was impossible to decipher under this kind of pressure. Another shot rang out, this one from below. It struck the rock near Anoli's head, and he cried out, clutching his arm. Blood bloomed through the sleeve of his coat. He was hit. "Anoli!" Yara cried out. "It's just a graze!" he gritted out, his face pale with pain. "But I can't hold them off for long." Panic began to set in. They were going to die here. The Hollow Tree men would take Ailey, and she and Anoli would be left for the wolves. The story would end here, on this desolate ridge. Then Ailey spoke, her voice small but clear. "The doll's eyes." Yara looked at her, confused. "What, honey?" "The lady in the tree. She said to look through the doll's eyes when the shadows fall," Ailey insisted, holding up the strange bark and twine figure. It was madness. The desperate fantasy of a terrified child. But they were out of options. Yara looked at the doll. Its face was a featureless knot of wood, but two small dark beads had been pushed into it, representing eyes. They were shiny, almost like polished obsidian. On a desperate whim, Yara grabbed the doll. She held it up, squinting through the two tiny beaded eyes like it was a pair of binoculars. And the world changed. Through the doll's eyes, the landscape was different. The trees, the rocks, the snow, they were all overlaid with a faint, shimmering web of blue lines, like a ghostly map projected onto the world. Most of the lines were faded, but one, starting from the base of the very boulder they were hiding behind, glowed with a bright, steady light. It led not up or down, but directly into the rock face itself. It was impossible. There was nothing there but solid granite. "Yara, they're coming!" Anoli warned, firing another shot. Yara's eyes darted from the glowing line back to the rock. It was solid, unmoving. Was she losing her mind? But the line on the doll's map was unwavering. It pointed to a section of the boulder covered in thick green moss. Trust the doll. Trust the ghost mother. Trust the child. "Behind the moss!" she yelled, not knowing if she was leading them to safety or to their deaths. "Push!" Anoli gave her a look of disbelief, but the desperation in her voice was enough. He scrambled over, his good arm pushing against the moss-covered rock. Yara joined him, throwing her shoulder against the cold, damp stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, grinding groan, the rock began to move. It wasn't a boulder. It was a door, a perfectly concealed entrance to a hidden passage engineered by someone with incredible skill. Her husband. Thomas had built this, a secret escape route, one of his shadow spots. "Get in," Anoli urged, pushing Ile and Yara through the narrow opening. The darkness inside was absolute. It smelled of damp earth and cold stone. Anoli stumbled in after them, and together they pushed the heavy stone door shut. The sound of gunfire was instantly muffled, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. They were safe. For now. They stood in the pitch black, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The pup, Tama, let out a low growl, the sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Light," Anoli whispered, his voice strained. Yara fumbled in her pack, her hands shaking, until she found a small tin of matches and a candle. She struck a match, the sudden flare of light blinding them for a second. In the flickering glow they saw they were in a narrow, man-made tunnel. The walls were rough-hewn stone, but the path was clear. It led deeper into the mountain. "He built this," Yara said in awe, running her hand along the cold wall. "He built a way out." "He was preparing for a war," Anoli said, leaning against the wall to inspect his wounded arm. Yara helped him tear the sleeve, revealing a nasty gash that was still bleeding steadily. She pressed a clean strip of cloth from her pack against the wound, her hands surprisingly steady. The immediate threat was over, but a new one had begun. They were trapped inside the mountain, with a wounded man and no idea where the tunnel led, and their enemies were right outside the door, knowing they were in here. They wouldn't be able to get in, but they could wait. They could starve them out. "What do we do now?" Anoli asked, his voice weary. Yara looked at Ile. The child was no longer trembling. In the candlelight, her face was calm, her eyes fixed on the doll she held in her hands. "We follow the path," Ile said softly. She held up the doll again. In the darkness of the tunnel, the blue line that glowed through its eyes was even brighter. It pointed straight down the tunnel, a luminous guide in the suffocating black. The mountain's heart, Amma's protection, Thomas's ingenuity. It had all converged in this one moment, in this one dark place. They had a map, a magic map, and it was their only hope. "All right," Yara said, taking the candle in one hand and her rifle in the other. "Let's see where this goes." They started walking, a wounded warrior, a grieving widow, and a magic child, deeper and deeper into the belly of the mountain, following a trail of ghostly blue light. The tunnel was a cold, silent world. The only sounds were the drip of water from the stone ceiling, the scuff of their boots on the gravelly floor, and their own ragged breathing. The candlelight threw their shadows up against the walls, making them dance like giant, distorted ghosts. They walked for what felt like hours, the blue line from the doll's eyes always leading them forward. The air grew colder, staler. Anoli was leaning heavily on Yara, his face pale and slick with sweat. The makeshift bandage on his arm was soaked through with blood. He was weakening. "We have to rest," Yara said, her voice echoing in the narrow passage. They found a small alcove, barely big enough for the three of them to sit. Yara gave Ile the last piece of dried meat and helped Anoli drink some water from their canteen. "They'll be waiting for us," Anoli murmured, his eyes closed. "At the entrance. We can't go back." "I know," Yara said. She looked down the tunnel. The blue line continued on, unwavering, into the darkness. "This has to lead somewhere. Thomas wouldn't have built a tomb." As they sat in the oppressive silence, Ely, who had been running her hands over the stone walls, suddenly stopped. "There's a picture here," she said. Yara brought the candle closer. Carved into the rock wall was a crude drawing. It was the same crescent moon symbol that was branded on Ely's skin. But inside the crescent was another shape. A tree, a hollow tree, and next to it a series of other symbols. A star, a fox, a river. "It's a story," Anoli whispered, his eyes tracing the carvings. "The star. That was your husband's sign for Amma. The black fox. That is my name, Anoli. The river. Our people believed it was the path to the spirit world." He was leaving us a message, Yara realized. He knew we might end up here. Ele's small finger traced the last symbol, one they hadn't noticed before. It was a simple carving of a woman holding a rifle. Yara. Her breath caught in her throat. Thomas had known. He had foreseen all of this. He had known that she, Anoli, and Ely would one day be in this tunnel together. He had left them a map, not just of the tunnel, but of their destiny. But what did it mean? As she stared at the carvings, the pup, Tama, who had been quiet until now, suddenly stood up and let out a low growl. He wasn't looking back down the tunnel, he was looking forward into the darkness ahead. "What is it, boy?" Yara whispered. Then they heard it, a faint rhythmic sound from deep within the mountain. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a hammer hitting rock. Someone else was in here. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through their exhaustion. Had the Hollow Tree men found another way in? Were they trapped between two enemy forces? Anoli struggled to his feet, grabbing his rifle. "We can't stay here." They pressed on, moving more quickly now, the rhythmic thumping growing louder with every step. The blue line from the doll's eyes began to flicker, growing brighter and then dimmer, as if it were a compass needle nearing its pole. The tunnel began to widen, opening up into a massive natural cavern. The air here was different, fresher. Yara could feel a faint draft. There had to be another way out. The thumping was loud now, echoing off the cavern walls. It was coming from the center of the chamber. As they rounded a massive pillar of rock, they saw the source of the sound, and they all froze in disbelief. The cavern was lit by a dozen lanterns. In the center was a small makeshift camp. Blankets, tools, a small fire pit. And there, swinging a pickaxe against a rock wall, was a man. He was old, his back bent with age, his hair and beard a wild tangle of white. He was dressed in the tattered, faded remnants of a surveyor's uniform. As they stepped into the light, he turned. His eyes, pale blue and clouded with cataracts, widened in shock. He dropped the pickaxe with a clatter. "Thomas?" Yara whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. It wasn't him, but the resemblance was uncanny. He had the same jawline, the same build. He looked like an older, more weathered version of her dead husband. The old man stared at them, his gaze sweeping over Anoli's wounded arm, Yara's rifle, and finally landing on the small, pale girl clutching a doll. His eyes filled with tears. He took a staggering step forward, his hand outstretched. "Ely?" he breathed, his voice thick with a lifetime of grief and hope. "My little star." Yara's mind reeled. This man knew her name. He knew the nickname Thomas had for his first love, Amma. Who was he? The old man looked at Yara, his pale eyes full of a sorrowful understanding. "You must be Yara," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. "He told me all about you. I am so sorry. For all of it." "Who are you?" Yara demanded, her rifle still held at the ready. The old man's shoulders slumped. "My name is Jacob. I was Thomas's father." The confession hit Yara like a physical blow. Thomas's father? Thomas had told her his parents had died in a fire when he was a boy. It was the foundation of his quiet, solitary nature. It was another lie. Her entire life with him had been built on a foundation of lies. "That's not possible," she stammered. "He said you were dead." "He had to," Jacob said, his voice heavy with regret. "We had to disappear. It was the only way to protect him. to protect our work. Your work? Anoli asked, stepping forward, his suspicion overriding his pain. What work? Jacob gestured around the cavern. Against the far wall were stacks of boxes, crates, and bundles. It looked like a hidden cache of supplies, but there was something else. Leaning against the wall were dozens of small wooden grave markers. Each one had a name carved into it, and a date. The Hollow Tree Men. They are not just a legend, Jacob said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They are a cult, an ancient sickness that has festered in these mountains for generations. They steal children, but they do not just sell them, they use them, for their rituals. They believe the children's life force can grant them immortality. He pointed to the grave markers. These are the ones we couldn't save, the ones they took. For 30 years my son and I have been fighting them, not with guns, but with knowledge. We mapped their tunnels, we learned their secrets, we freed who we could. A secret family of vigilantes, fighting a shadow war in the mountains. It was insane. Thomas. He found out about his daughter, Ailey. Jacob continued, his eyes misting over. He was trying to get to her when they caught him. The fever. It was no fever. They poisoned him. They made it look natural. They thought his secrets died with him. He looked at Yara, a desperate plea in his eyes. But he told me he had left everything for you. The journal, the cabin. He trusted you. He knew that if anyone could finish what we started, it would be you. So it was true. All of it. Her husband hadn't been a quiet surveyor. He was a hero, a fallen soldier in a secret war. The lies he told were not to deceive her, but to protect her. Before she could process this new, earth-shattering reality, a deep, booming sound echoed from the tunnel they had just come from. Boom! The ground shook. Dust rained down from the ceiling. They've blasted the entrance, Anoli said, his face grim. They're coming through. The Hollow Tree Men were no longer waiting. They were coming for them. There is another way out, Jacob said, his old eyes hardening with a sudden fierce resolve. He pointed his pickaxe towards the rock wall he had been chipping away at. Through here. It leads to the old silver mine. From there, we can get to the surface on the other side of the mountain. But it is blocked. I have been trying to clear it for weeks. The thumping they had heard wasn't a threat. It was the sound of hope, the sound of an old man trying to dig his way to freedom. They're coming, Ailey cried, pointing back at the tunnel entrance. Figures were emerging from the darkness. At the lead was the man with the cold hands, and behind him, a taller, more terrifying figure. He was draped in black furs, his face a pale, skeletal mask of bone. On his head, he wore a crown of gnarled branches. The elder. The child belongs to the mountain. The elder's voice boomed, a fanatic's cry that filled the cavern. Give her to us and your deaths will be swift. Not today, Yara said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. She was no longer just a widow. She was her husband's legacy. She cocked her rifle. Jacob, keep digging, she commanded. Anoli, with me. Eli, stay back. The final battle had come. Here, in the heart of the mountain, surrounded by the ghosts of lost children, they would make their stand. The cavern erupted into a maelstrom of violence. The elders' men, at least 10 of them, poured out of the tunnel, their rifles flashing in the lantern light. They were fanatics, their faces grim and emotionless, moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. Yara and Anoli took cover behind the stacks of crates, firing back with a desperate precision. Each shot was a prayer. Each bullet was a defense of the small life huddled behind them. Jacob, his old body moving with a surprising speed, swung the pickaxe with renewed vigor, the sound of metal on rock a frantic heartbeat beneath the roar of the guns. They're trying to flank us, Anoli yelled, pointing to 2 men who were creeping along the cavern wall. Yara took aim, her breath steady, and fired. One of the men went down. The other scrambled back into the shadows. She had killed a man. The thought barely registered. There was no room for anything but the fight. Cold Hands was directing them, his voice a guttural bark, pushing his men forward relentlessly. But the true threat was the Elder. He stood back, near the tunnel entrance, not firing a shot, just watching the chaos unfold with an unnerving calm, his bone mask gleaming in the flickering light. He was waiting. A bullet ricocheted off a crate near Yara's head, sending splinters flying. They were being overwhelmed. There were too many. "It's not going to break!" Jacob yelled, his voice ragged with exhaustion. He stumbled back from the rock wall, the pickaxe falling from his hands. "The rock is too thick!" They were trapped. The escape route was gone. The Elder seemed to sense their despair. He took a slow step forward. It is over. The prophecy must be fulfilled. As he spoke, Ailey, who had been hiding behind Jacob, did something unexpected. She stepped out into the open. She held the small bark and twine doll high above her head. "You can't have me," she cried, her small voice echoing with a power that defied her size. "My mother protects me. My fathers protect me." The Elder stopped. He stared at the doll, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty seemed to cross his posture. "A spirit doll," he hissed, the sound like snakes rustling in dry leaves. "A useless trinket against the will of the mountain." He raised his hand, and his men surged forward for a final, overwhelming assault. But as they charged, Ailey did something else. She closed her eyes, and she began to hum. It was a low, resonant sound, the same strange, ancient tune Yara had heard her hum in the cabin. And as she hummed, the doll in her hand began to glow. It started as a faint blue light, the same color as the lines on their magic map. But it grew in intensity, pulsing with the rhythm of her humming, until the entire cavern was bathed in an ethereal, otherworldly blue light. The charging men stopped in their tracks, shielding their eyes from the brilliant, unnatural glow. The Elder himself staggered back, his bone mask unable to protect him from the sheer power emanating from the child. The blue light pulsed once, twice, and then shot out from the doll, not as a beam, but as a wave. It washed over the hollow tree men, and they screamed. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of pure, soul-shattering terror. They dropped their rifles, clutching their heads as if confronted by a horror only they could see. The light washed over the cavern walls, and for a moment, the air shimmered. The faces of children, dozens of them, seemed to appear in the rock, their eyes wide, their mouths open in a silent, ghostly chorus. The spirits of the lost children, drawn by the doll's power. The Elder shrieked, a high, thin sound of absolute fear. "No! The spirits are bound! They cannot interfere!" But they were. Ailey, through the doll, had given them a voice, a weapon. The cavern began to shake violently. Rocks and dust rained down from the ceiling. The structure of the mountain itself seemed to be rebelling. "The mine is collapsing!" Jacob yelled. "We have to get out!" The rock wall he had been striking, weakened by his efforts and the violent tremors, suddenly cracked. A fissure appeared, then another, until a section of the wall crumbled inwards, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The way out. "Go, now!" Yara screamed. She grabbed Ailey, pulling her towards the opening. Anoli, despite his wound, provided cover, firing at the disoriented and terrified cultists. Jacob scooped up his son's journal from Yara's discarded pack, clutching it like a holy relic. They scrambled through the opening into the dark, damp confines of the old silver mine, the sound of the collapsing cavern behind them a deafening roar. They ran, stumbling through the darkness, following the faint draft of fresh air until they saw it. A pale circle of light high above them, an old ventilation shaft, away to the surface. They climbed, using a rickety old ladder, emerging one by one into the cold, clean air of the mountainside. They were on the far side of the peak, miles from where they had started. They stood there, breathing in the air of freedom, and looked back. The entire face of the mountain where the mine entrance had been was gone, buried under a massive landslide of rock and snow. The cavern, the elder, his men, the ghosts of the children, they were all buried forever, sealed in a tomb of their own making. It was over. They had survived. The days that followed were a blur of quiet healing. They found shelter in an old abandoned trapper's lean-to that Jacob knew of. Yara tended to Anoli's arm, which was already beginning to heal under Jacob's surprisingly skilled care with poultices made from mountain herbs. The four of them, a strange and broken quartet, began to form a new kind of family. Jacob would tell stories of his son, filling in the missing pieces of Yara's life, replacing the lies with a truth that was painful but pure. Anoli taught Eli the Lakota names for the stars and the trees, connecting her to a heritage that had almost been stolen from her. And Yara simply became a mother. She taught Eli how to track, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to be strong and self-reliant. One evening, as they sat around a small warm fire, Eli held up the doll. The glow was gone. It was just an object of bark and twine again. "Is the magic gone?" she asked, a touch of sadness in her voice. Yara smiled, putting an arm around the girl. "No, little one. The magic wasn't in the doll. It was in you. It always was." Jacob looked at the three of them, his old eyes filled with a peaceful light. "Thomas would be proud," he said softly. "He always believed that family wasn't just about blood. It was about who you stand with when the shadows fall." They had stood together. They had fought. And they had won. They were no longer running. They were no longer hiding. They were survivors. A new family, forged in fire and shadow, finally stepping out into the light. The mountain was no longer a place of ghosts and grief. It was home. And for the first time since she had buried her husband, Yara looked up at the vast, star-filled sky and felt a sense of peace. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story of survival and the unbreakable bonds of family, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the edge of the world. And let us know in the comments below. What do you think happened to the spirits of the lost children? Were they finally set free? We want to hear your thoughts.